If there's one thing that's never as it seems, it's history, especially the history of war. And it doesn't really take a genius to understand why that's so. However, it's not just laymen that tend to get things mixed up by throwing inaccurate historical facts around. In fact, certain events and the propaganda surrounding them have even left historians in the lurch. Today, let's look at some of the things that we, historians included, got completely wrong about the Second World War. First up, Hitler was not the only one to blame. Although many of us wouldn't mind all the blame falling to Hitler's lot, this myth serves to write off the role of the common man. That is to say, it completely disregards how it would have taken Hitler twice the effort to execute his plans had it not been for the racism seething in the veins of the everyday masses. Several anthropological studies, in fact, prove that it's mob violence and mentalities that eventually lead governments to legalize marginalization. Think about it. Your local politicians would never pass a law if they knew that you'd protest it and it could hurt their positions. But the commoners aside, Hitler would have never risen to power from a simple Nazi propagandist were it not for the support of countless generals who saw promise in his vows to restore Germany to its former glory. A senior historian at the National World War II Museum, Rob Citino, has also confirmed this in an interview with Time magazine. To elaborate, he explained that Hitler was able to proceed undeterred because the generals were happy to do his bidding and keep the war going. He was, after all, expanding the army and increasing their chances of a promotion. However, after the war, most of these generals decided that the Führer had put them in jeopardy, and therefore the destruction wasn't really their cross to bear. This hypocrisy is why Citino refers to the generals' memoirs as fables. Simply put, their tall tales heavily rely on the "it was all Hitler" line of thought to absolve themselves and conceal their utmost support of his nefarious schemes. Next, Germany had the most war machines. If you thought that fighting on horseback was a medieval thing, you have another thing coming. Believe it or not, the Germans were mostly fighting the Second World War on foot or using non-motorized vehicles, more commonly known as horse carts. We know it sounds like we're joking, but Germany was the least automotive of all the developed countries when the war broke out. But what about their claims? Well, firstly, there's a kernel of truth to them, considering that the Germans were able to capture a large number of enemy vehicles, and thus somewhat mechanized. But here's the catch. Once these vehicles broke down, they didn't have the slightest idea how to fix them. And even if they did somehow put two and two together, they didn't have any of the spare parts that would have done the job. This perfectly explains why most of the vehicles that Germany lost were due to mechanical failures. Now, the second factor that helped this myth thrive and survive was the power of German propaganda. Basically, they televised a large number of tanks and also used the radio to convince the world of Germany's prowess. As a matter of fact, they were such efficient propagandists that even Hitler, himself a propagandist of the highest order, started believing in Germany's military genius at some point. Nonetheless, and regardless of the efficacy of their blitzkrieg technique, involving swift and secret tank attacks, we can't deny the fact that only 16 of Germany's 135 divisions were mechanized. And we mean, if we're being completely honest, blitzkrieg's genius was also blown out of proportion by the French. Up next, the Axis could have won. For those of you who mostly slept through high school history, the Axis was the military alliance that initiated the war, primarily composed of Germany, Italy, and Japan. It was up against countries like the UK, the US, the USSR, present-day Russia, and France and China as well. To make things simpler for ourselves, we call these other sets of countries the Allied powers. Now that the basic history lesson is over, let's proceed to the misconception at hand. And who better to dismiss it than an actual history teacher? Joe Maiolo, a historian and professor at King's College London, who specializes in everything warfare related, has dismissed the idea that the Axis could have won the war on the following grounds. First things first, there wasn't even an alliance to begin with. Simply put, Italy was nothing but a failed fascist state, and Japan was too busy doing its own thing to have agreed to a single strategy. This left Germany, with its meager mechanization and fluky victories, alone in the race to defeat the Allies. Even though historians have entertained this idea on account of the Blitzkrieg's success and Germany's victory over France, these factors were actually not strategic enough in the long run. All things considered, Maiolo thinks that instead of flogging this dead horse, historians should instead focus on how industrial resources and manpower helped the Allies win more quickly. Next, 1 million American lives were saved. War-torn people do and say all manner of weird things, but it's been 77 years since the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the Americans still can't seem to get over the 1 million lives saved myth. To elaborate, at the time of the bombings, a number of Americans were tricked into buying the state's propaganda that insisted that Japan would never have backed down were it not for the bombs. or that a Japanese military invasion was just around the corner and had to be dealt with an iron fist. Furthermore, the US even boasted of helping the war end quicker than it originally would have. However, several researchers have proven that most of these justifications were based on nothing but hoaxes. Even the 1 million figure was, in fact, a fabrication by a government employee by the name of McGeorge Bundy. Bundy, who published an essay on the bombings in Harper's Magazine in 1947, was asked to do it under the name of the former Secretary of War, Henry L. Stimson. This essay is what birthed this myth, but to this day, nobody has been able to provide data that could substantiate it. Opposingly, Japan has the statistics to prove the loss of 80,000 and 40,000 lives lost in Hiroshima and Nagasaki respectively. This, combined with the myriad deaths that occurred in the subsequent years due to radiation poisoning, makes the survival of this myth to this day seem quite callous on part of the human race. Next up, kamikaze pilots were volunteers. As interesting as the term kamikaze sounds, derived from the Japanese words for God and wind, being a kamikaze pilot wasn't all fun and games. For those of you who are unaware, these pilots' only purpose was to fly into enemy warships in order to heavily damage or outright destroy them. Now, that doesn't sound like an opportunity that you jump at, and honestly, it wasn't. Most of these pilots were teenagers who'd signed up for the Air Force to avoid heavy fighting on land. However, once they were on the plane, it became clear to them that this would be their last fight altogether. From what we know, there were around 4,000 Japanese pilots that died this way. And these numbers are pretty believable because in the face of dwindling resources and the growing threat, suicide missions did become Japan's go-to defense. Although some of them might have happily volunteered, a 2017 BBC interview with former kamikaze pilots has removed all of our doubts. "I was scared. I didn't want to die," said Keiichi Kuwahara, one of the 2 pilots invited to the show. And if this isn't enough proof, then we'd like you to know that the application process for the position was simply a raise of the hand. However, this was usually done in front of large crowds, and therefore had more to do with saving face and peer pressure than patriotism and volunteer work. And the war only lasted for 4 years. Even though that popular narrative insists that the war began in 1939, with Germany's invasion of Poland, from a global perspective, it was already underway since 1935. And here's why. In 1937, Japan and China were already fighting over the access route to Beijing, then Beiping. Although it began as a series of skirmishes in the proximity of the Marco Polo Bridge, it soon developed into a full-blown war that ended in the areas of Beiping and its port city Tianjin coming under Japanese occupation. Similar to these incidents, the incidents of Germany's involvement in the Italian Civil War from 1936 to 1939, and Italy's invasion of Abyssinia or Ethiopia from 1935 to 1937 are also considered as one of the events of the Second World War. And if you really think about it, the immigrant crises because of the Holocaust and all other manners of persecution, that too on top of the aforementioned radiation sickness, has in its own ways made the war last to this day. But anywho, and sentimentality aside, it was only the US that fought the war for a total of 4 years. Most of the other nations were actually in their 8th year by the time it officially ended in 1945. That's a wrap for this video. Do you think we should take all history with a grain of salt? And if not, how do you figure out if something is credible or a plain lie? Let us know in the comments below. Make sure to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more videos like this. See you in the next one.